magnetize your minis, flight stands, custom kits, and all the hobby supplies you'll need from themagnetbaron.com.
Hello and welcome to the YouTube channel for craftworldeldar.com. I'm Brent, and this is part 2 of my 10th edition Aeldari Index review. In part 1, I talked about Craftworld's characters and about aspect warriors, and part 2, I'll be covering Wraith units, vehicles, outcasts, and guardians because they don't fit anywhere else. But before I do, I have an apology and a retraction. In the last video, I said the stupidest thing that I have said in 2 years of making these videos. It was a throwaway sentence at the beginning. I said pretty much everything in the index is good. There's 4 units that I said probably don't have competitive prospects. I named the Webway Gate, stand by it. The aircraft units, absolutely stand by that. But oof, I committed the unpardonable sin of mentioning the Wraith Knight. The reason I did is that I was reviewing 60 data sheets over the weekend. I didn't spend enough time with this one. I just kind of forgot that the towering keyword exists now. I forgot that the Wraith Knight is now a legal target for Fortune. And I was comparing it to other long-range, really hard-hitting fire options that are much cheaper and can be kept completely hidden, whereas Titanic units don't hide behind terrain. But now, of course, nothing hides from them, which is a huge game changer. So apologies, the Wraith Knight's awesome, and out of deference to its Titanic majesty and the fact that it is back after 2 editions in the penalty box for having been too good back when people still made jokes about dubstep and knew what that is. Does it still exist? We will start with the Wraith Knight data card. Okay, let's start with the stat line. So the Wraith Knight has a 10-inch move, it's toughness 12, it has a 2-up save, great. Right, so up from 3 up last time, which will be important for reasons we'll get to in just a moment. It's down to 18 wounds. That's okay. It's durable in other ways. Leadership 6, objective control 10. Cool. That could be important. And it has access to the same general weapon loadouts that it has had previously. They're kind of similar to how they were before, except the heavy Wraith Cannon is up to strength 20. It does 2d6 damage. D3 attacks, and has both blast and devastating wounds, and that is going to make it the obvious standout. I'll talk about that in just a moment. The Wraith Knight still has Wraithbone form, so you subtract 1 from damage characteristic of incoming fire. That's important because A, most units in the game that had damage reduction have lost it, and B, with the slightly reduced wounds, that's going to help it be durable. It no longer has the 5-up invulnerable save that it used to have without the scatter shield, which would be a problem, except that the 2-up save means that against stuff with -4 AP, you can still use your fate dice to auto-succeed on a saving roll by expending a 6. Now, it's agile. It can just step over models and terrain features that are less than 4 inches in height, so that's good too. The possible weapons, I think that there's one standout build. There's one build that's really not worth it, and everything else is potentially usable if you have more than 1 Wraith Knight. But if you're running 1 Wraith Knight, I think the move is 2 heavy Wraith Cannons. So that would give you 2d3 attacks, strength hitting on 3s, but you can throw guide on it, I suppose, if you want to. Keeping in mind, too, that just the detachment rule for Eldar, everything gets 1 free reroll to hit and 1 free reroll to wound. So on average, this thing would be putting out 4 shots with the heavy Wraith Cannons, hitting on 3s, but with the reroll, that's pretty solid, even if you don't, you don't do anything with it to improve that. Strength 20 is pretty crazy, and then you could also use a fate die to trigger devastating wounds, so whatever you hit, -4 AP, but then like if you're shooting something with an invulnerable save, you could just, or just really good armor, you could just push through 2d6 wounds that, because of devastating wounds, would then become mortal wounds for every hit with the Wraith Cannons. And after the designer commentary, there was a hot minute there where it looked like, because the damage characteristic in the mortal wounds. Back in the previous edition, in 9th edition, if something converted into mortal wounds, it wasn't the same thing as a damage roll, but they clarified in the designer's commentary that released alongside the munitions field manual that the conversion to mortal wounds happens after other stuff. So you could actually use a fate dice to make this 6 mortal wounds plus d6 mortal wounds. That would be pretty crazy. And that means that the Wraith Knight is in the D cannon, and the Prism cannon is not just effective against hard targets with those 2 Wraith cannons. Like, you could blow away with the mortal wounds an infantry unit or a bunch of T5 orcs that are running at you or something, because those mortal wounds all just bleed over, which is pretty powerful. They've done a pretty good job in this edition of eliminating anything that is effective against all types of target. The one loophole seems to be mortal wounds that there's probably something else somewhere in the game, but the Eldar ability to use fate dice to automatically trigger devastating wounds on something that's high damage output where it just becomes mortal wounds and now it's effective against any kind of target in the game. That is one of the only types of weapon in the game that's left that's just effective against everything. And if we do get a nerf, that's kind of what I'm expecting to get hit. I could totally see it going to fate dice can't trigger devastating wounds, or maybe they just count as modified dice rolls or something, so that they wouldn't trigger either devastating wounds or sustained hits or lethal hits or any of that stuff. And the fact that I personally feel like my army would still be very competitive with that change tells me that it's probably not totally unreasonable. I'm kind of expecting something like that at some point. But we'll see. We don't have there's no tournament data yet. We have to see how everything plays on the table relative to other stuff to really be sure. But man, the fact that you can have a Wraith Knight blasting away with the 2 Wraith cannons and just kind of killing anything is pretty amazing. And here's the other part of that equation. The towering keyword is important. In the previous edition, in 9th edition, Titanic units were visible to everything on the battlefield. Anything could target them, but they couldn't shoot anything. And now Wraith Knights just ignore obscuring terrain such that, unless the terrain piece literally makes it impossible to draw true line of sight to something, the Wraith Knight can target it. And most of the things that a Wraith Knight would want to target, most of the hard targets, are going to be big enough models that it's going to be tough, especially if a person is using GW terrain. It's going to be tough to position that model such that, I don't know, the lion or something, to position that. The lion's a terrible example because he has lone operative. The only thing that the Wraith Knight is not dangerous to is stuff with lone operative, where you have to be within 12 inches. But pretty much anything else, right? If the Wraith Knight has true line of sight on it and can target it, that's a lot like just having indirect fire. So although the Wraith Cannon is not true indirect fire, it's kind of going to function that way, which makes a pair of Wraith Cannons the obvious standout choice for a single Wraith Knight. It's really good. There's no list you could come up against in which your opponent would not be worried about that. But to be fair, there's also no list you could come up against in which your opponent's not going to be somewhat worried about your D cannons, your fire prisms, and plenty of other units available to Eldar. But the heavy Wraith cannons are really scary for sure. There's no two ways about it. You could, of course, give the Wraith Knight the old shield and sword combination and have it be a force in the midfield. And I think that's not a bad way to play it, but I think that the Avatar of Cain does that job a lot better for 85 points less. So I don't see that as an optimal build, and I don't think you need more than one unit doing something like that. And the Sun Cannon is just it's not bad, right? The Sun Cannon is 2d6 shots, strength or ballistic skill 3, strength 8, -3, flat 3. So it kills heavy infantry and bikes really effectively, and it could do some damage to a tank. One of the weaknesses to the Sun Cannon is that that number of attacks, 2d6. There's no real way to cheat that. You could end up with a bad roll. There might be some argument for one heavy Wraith cannon and one Sun cannon on a second Wraith Knight, maybe. Because you wouldn't have enough sixes to just like be auto mortal wounding with all of the Wraith cannons on multiple Knights. But the fact is that any of these loadouts are pretty scary, and I think the Wraith Knight, despite the fact that it has 18 wounds, with the damage reduction and the toughness 12 and the ability to auto succeed against really hard hits, that's really what puts it over for me. If you throw fortune on it, if your opponent gets first turn, obviously you're not going to have the opportunity to do that. But if you throw fortune on the Wraith Knight, most heavy weapons in the game at best are going to be wounding it on, well, any heavy weapon in the game at best is going to be wounding it on a 4-up, and most of them are going to be wounding it on a 5-up, which is pretty good resistance. And then the fact that you can auto succeed using the fate dice on a 6, if your opponent hits you with something really hard, like flat 6 damage, or in a mirror match, like 8 damage with a D cannon or something, you can always spend a 6 to auto succeed on a save. And the fact that your Farseer ability works on both players' turns, right? So really your Foot Farseer or your Bike Farseer or whatever is turning 2 dice per round. So over the course of the game, 10 dice to 6s. You should, on your opponent's turn, you will always have at least one. If there's a Farseer near your Wraithseer, if you have any fate dice left at all, you'll always have at least one potential auto success on an armor save. That said, there are going to be lists that you could come up against where if you don't get first turn, they stand a pretty good chance of picking up a Wraith Knight, a mirror match, for example. And it is possible that in those matchups, you may want to start your Wraith Knight in strategic reserves, but I don't think that you're ever going to be sorry that you have the model in your list. It's a highly competitive pick. 2 last things about the Wraith Knight before we move on. 1, vehicles and Titanic units can benefit from cover now. This was not the case in the previous edition, so it's not really on some of our radars. The 2-up armor save means that the Wraith Knight is robust against massed small arms fire, and the damage reduction is really good. You still might occasionally have an issue against something with like -2 AP that's only 1 damage, that's high enough volume of fire that it can ding it for a few hits. It's important to remember that there is value in keeping a big terrain piece between your Wraith Knight and mass fire like that. It'll improve the armor save. And last thing, here's a good trick. If you move the Wraith Knight out of your deployment zone towards the midfield, you create this 24-inch bubble. This is also true of units like Fire Prisms, but the Wraith Knight is durable enough that this is pretty awesome. Also, the Avatar of Cain can also do this with the Wailing Doom, but I should have talked about that in the last video. But if you move the Wraith Knight towards the middle of the table with that 10-inch move on turn 1, you put your opponent in this really awkward situation, because the way the Overwatch stratagem works now, you have this 24-inch bubble around you where at the end of your opponent's movement phase, you can trigger Overwatch. And because even though you only hit on 6s on Overwatch, because you're sitting on your fate dice, you could, on your opponent's turn, scoot your Wraith Knight forward and just have this 24-inch bubble around it, where anything your opponent moves into that 24-inch bubble, you're just guaranteed to be able to blast it with a heavy Wraith Cannon, which with the dice manipulation that we have, you can probably pretty much guarantee that thing is successful. So that's just a huge deterrent to your opponent moving their own high-value challenge bully units into the midfield. Again, you don't need to necessarily do this with the Wraith Knight. It works with a variety of units, but wow, is the Wraith Knight a good candidate for that control move. Okay, let's talk about the Spirit Seer. Makes sense to talk about the Spirit Seer next, because the Spirit Seer can join any kind of Wraith infantry unit, or you can even attach it to a Wraith Lord, but I wouldn't probably do that. The Spirit Seer is really good. It's one of our best leader units, clearly, because Wraith infantry are actually good now. It's only 65 points. It does 2 things for the unit that it is attached to. 1, it grants lethal hits to that unit, so 6s to hit will auto wound, and you can add 1 to the hit roll, which is especially good for Wraiths, which I suppose because they are ghost elves, only half invested in physical reality, hit on 4s. So bringing them to 3s makes them significantly more dangerous. And now here's the one that's just kind of mind-bogglingly fabulous. The Tears of Isha. While this model is leading a unit in the command phase, you can return 1 destroyed bodyguard model to that unit. Now, the fact that this reads the command phase and not your command phase is important because it means that per battle round, you're resurrecting 2 Wraith Blades or Wraith Guard, and that's pretty awesome. I was jealous in the last edition of armies that could like resurrect Terminators. Like you may remember the Emperor's Children build that was always bringing its Terminators back. It was so hard to deal with, and I thought it was a bit unfair the last time around that Ynnari could not resurrect Wraiths. I thought that would not have created some kind of power imbalance. And not only can the Spirit Seer resurrect your Wraiths, but the Spirit Seer can bring back 2 Wraiths per round. That's pretty great. I will mention it cannot, as some people have been suggesting on the internet, it cannot resurrect a slain Wraith Lord, because once the Wraith Lord is gone, there's no bodyguard unit to return models to, and that has a unit cap of 1. So there's no resurrecting your Dreadnought with full wounds remaining, but you can do it with the Wraith Infantry. The Spirit Seer is a bit fragile with toughness 3 and a 4-up invuln, only 3 wounds, and so you do. The one challenge I think that the Spirit Seer faces is, I think most opponents are going to have stuff in their list with precision. They're going to have enough precision shooting to be able to eliminate exactly this kind of character. This kind of character is the reason that precision exists. It's like, ooh, that unit has an officer model that's really buffing it. The officer's cheap and fragile, and I really need to pop the officer. So the move, I think, is to give the Spirit Seer the Phoenix Gem. This means you're not giving it to that Autarch Wayleaper I mentioned in the last video. But if you are running a big unit of Wraiths, it absolutely makes sense to add the Spirit Seer, and at which point it's a much better candidate for that enhancement than is the Wayleaper. So the Phoenix Gem lets a slain character model resurrect on a 2-up at the end of phase, which means your opponent can't pop it multiple times in the same phase with full wounds remaining. Now, even though Wraith Infantry has gotten cheaper, if you give the Spirit Seer that enhancement, it takes the Spirit Seer to 90 points because it's 25 points, and then if you have 10 Wraith Guard, that's 310 points. So this is just this package is a flat 400 points. So that's a pretty expensive investment, but wow, is it a powerful and durable tool for controlling the midfield, for taking objectives. I think one of the issues that the best way for an opponent to deal with Wraith Infantry, I think, is going to be to use abilities and stuff to keep them battle shocked, so that they don't have any presence on objectives, and you can't do other tricky stuff with them. But to be fair, they have some tricky stuff that we're going to talk about in a moment that is just unpreventable. Wraiths are really good. Spirit Seer is a great leader character. Okay, let's talk Wraith Guard. I think of the 2 Wraith Infantry options, I think they're both very good. I think Wraith Guard are a little bit stronger, possibly just in part because they're cheaper. They also do a different job than the Wraith Blades. So Wraith Guard are movement 6, toughness 7, 2-up save. That's great for reasons we've already covered. They've gone to a 2-up save. And the toughness 7 is good, so they're a little bit tougher than they were before. Small arms are going to struggle into them with the 2-up save and the toughness 7. They've got the War Construct ability. Once per battle round, when an enemy unit targets this unit, after that unit is finished making its attacks, this unit can shoot as if it were your shooting phase. And when doing so, this unit's ranged weapons have the pistol ability. That is so crazy good for reasons I will get to in a moment. There are 2 different possible weapons loadouts like before. There's the Wraith Cannon and there is the D-Scythe. And I'm going to say it right now, you want the Wraith Cannon on your models, absolutely, no question, especially given that they cost the same points. So the Wraith Cannon is 18-inch range, 1 attack, ballistic skill 4, but if you have the Spirit Sea in there, it goes to a 3. Strength 14, woo! Even really hard targets like heavy tanks are still going to be wounded on 3-up. AP -4, D6 damage. You could always use Strands of Fate to max that out. And devastating wounds. So 6s to wound simply do mortals, which means that the Wraith Cannon is also effective against light infantry. Another reason that you don't need the D-Scythe, which gives you D6 attacks, strength 10, -4 AP, but only 1 damage. So even into Space Marines, the D-Scythe is like not really what you want. The Wraith Cannon is the way forward. But let's back up a bit. So what makes War Construct so freaking amazing is that it essentially it doubles the rate of fire of your Wraiths. So they move, they shoot something, and if something shoots them back, they can then shoot as if it were your shooting phase. So it's not like an Overwatch attack. They shoot as if it were your shooting phase. And the fact that they get the pistol keyword when they're doing that means that they can also do this in melee. Now, it's once per battle round, so you can't like shoot in your shooting phase, then shoot in your opponent's shooting phase, and then also shoot in your opponent's melee. You can't do that, but here's what you can do. You can shoot in the shooting phase, you can charge something, and they have a pretty decent melee profile. They don't have AP, but they're 3 attacks at strength 5, weapon skill 4. But if they have the Spirit Seer with them, that would go to weapon skill 3. And then your opponent would hit you back. But then the War Construct ability, you don't have to spend CP or anything, it's just there, lets you, you get the pistol ability, and pistols can shoot in close combat. So you would then shoot again. So on your turn, you shoot something with your crazy powerful Wraith Cannons with the devastating wounds. You charge that thing, you club it a little bit with the gun butts, and then it hits you back. If you're charging something like a tank or a sort of mediocre infantry squad, it's not going to do any damage to you. And then you shoot it again with the Wraith Cannons. There's not a whole lot in the game that these are not going to mess up really significantly in a single round. And they're durable. You're going to be able to keep them on the board probably for multiple turns. I mentioned in my previous video how heavy infantry creates this weird, like, inefficiency for your opponent's shooting units, because Wraithguard are really robust against small arms, and even against stuff that does flat 2 damage. Like, obviously that's better than stuff that does 1 damage, but you still need to overkill each model in order to actually kill it, because you have to do 4 damage to kill 1. You've got to get 2 hits through. And yeah, you can target them with something that does like D6 plus 2, and that kills them outright. But that means that your opponent is shooting a single Wraith infantry model rather than shooting your Avatar of Cain or your Wraith Knight or your Fire Prism or whatever. And so it's just annoying. It's only stuff that's like -4 AP, strength 7 or better, flat 3 damage that's really good into these guys. And there isn't a ton of stuff. Your opponent might have something like that in their list, but there isn't a ton of stuff like that. And then with your Spirit Seer just resurrecting 2 per battle round, these are going to be really hard for an opponent to get rid of. And that's pretty exciting. And also because they are infantry, unlike some of the other big, tough hard hitters that we've talked about, like the Avatar of Cain or the Wraith Knight, because they're infantry, they can run straight through walls. They can play the objective game. They can do actions if you need them to. Obviously, you want them to be fighting, but if you need them to. And that is important also. So Wraithguard are really good. If you're running 10 of them, I think it makes sense to have a Spirit Seer. I think there's an excellent argument for running 10 of these things. It's a really solid tool, and it gives your craft worlders just bizarre durability that they've never had. Okay, Wraith Blades. Wraith Blades are like Wraithguard, except for 2 differences. One, they're more expensive. Wraithguard are $155, which I should have mentioned is just a crazy good deal for them. That's really what gets me to wanting to consider big units of them. I mentioned what 10 costs, so you could have done the math and figured 5. But even just in units of 5, wow, so worth it. It's only a little bit. 5 Wraithguard are only a little bit more than what are like Aspect Warrior squads with an Exarch upgrade cost in the last edition, and they were super fragile. Wraith Blades, so they're a little more expensive. They don't have a shooting profile, and they don't do that. They don't have anywhere near the damage output, because it's not like they're shooting a thing, charging it, clubbing it, shooting it again. But if you give Wraith Blades the shields They now have a 4-up invulnerable save on top of that 2-up regular save, the toughness 7, being able to use the other tricks that I talked about. One of the nice things about that 4-up invuln 2 is that you can auto-succeed on your armor saves, and you don't need 6s to do it. You can use your fate dice of 4 to just auto-succeed, and if you ran a big unit of them again, you'd be resurrecting 2 per turn. It would be very difficult for an opponent to get rid of. Pretty powerful for objective control, for doing the mission, for also just as like tar pit units and blocking units to prevent your opponent from getting into your squishy backline. I mean, honestly, your backline might not even be that squishy depending on how you build your list, but you might have a squishy backline. We are elves at the end of the day. Wraith Blades are a great screening unit. The Wraith Blade ability, instead of that other cool thing that the Wraith Guard do, they have Malevolent Souls, which is on a 4, when they're killed on a 4-up, they get to fight before they get removed. And that's good. That's solid. I will say that I think it's just kind of obvious that you take the axes and shields. I don't want this to be true. I think the Ghost Swords look cooler. I really like my Ghost Sword Wraith Blades. I have 10... I have a lot of Wraith Blades in my collection, but 10 of them are magnetized, so they can have anything. And I just love having the Ghost Swords on there. They're, they look like ghost blenders or something. But the fact is that really what the Wraith Blades are doing for you is durability, and the slight damage uptick in the Ghost Swords, it's just not really worth it. So if you give them the Ghost Swords, they have 5 attacks, strength 6, -2 AP, flat 1 damage. So really powerful against light infantry, but you've already got a lot of ways to deal with light infantry. The Ghost Axe, you go down to 3 attacks, but you're up to strength 7, and it's 2 damage instead of 1 damage. So I feel like the Ghost Axes with the shields are just objectively better. There's kind of no reason you would ever want the swords. Okay, the Wraith Lord. The Wraith Lord is good. Movement 8, toughness 11, 2-up save, 10 wounds, objective control of 3. That's nice. And you can give him any of the weapons on each shoulder and the ghost glaives. So there's no reason you'd ever give him Wraithbone Fists. The only reason there are even still rules for those is some people built the Wraith Lord that way, and we want them to be able to still use their model. But you obviously give him the sword. There are arguments for various loadouts, but I think you probably are going to want twin Bright Lances on this guy for the simple reason that points are all fixed now, and it's just 160 points for the Wraith Lord. The Wraith Lord is good. It's a durable, like, midfield control monster, counter puncher. The Ghost Glaive hits really hard. It's either a strike profile, 4 attacks, hits on 4s, strength 10, -3 AP, d6 + 1 damage, or the sweep is 8 attacks, but flat 2 at strength 7, -2 AP. We know what all of the heavy weapons do. I'll just tell you that they hit on 4s. And he's also got Fated Hero. Each time this model destroys an enemy unit, roll 1d6 and add it to your fate dice pool, displaying the result that you just rolled. So if he kills something, he gets you another fate dice. That's nice. There's no question that this model is good and would be annoying for an opponent to deal with, especially in a list with other tough stuff, alongside stuff like if there's a Wraith Knight that your opponent is focused on killing, your opponent is not really going to be focused on killing your Wraith Lords. I am a little skeptical about this guy for the simple reason that I think, because so much of the stuff in our list is so competitively costed, I don't know if... I think 160 points is kind of objectively reasonable for him, but we have some great deals in the index, and I think maybe compared to some of those other deals, like if I can get a Fire Prism at 120, that's really good. I think I would rather than the Wraith Lord, I might rather have, for about the same price, 5 Wraith Guard with the Wraith Cannons. But it's great that he generates extra dice for you. I guess the other way that I'm thinking about this is you're not going to attach a Spirit Seer to him, so he really is locked into that ballistic skill and weapon skill of 4 up. And yes, you can use Fate Dice to auto hit, but you have a lot of stuff in your army where you might want to use Fate Dice to auto hit. If you need a little bit of extra, like, durable melee presence in the midfield, I think he's a good pick. But if you've already got the Avatar of Cain in your army, and the Avatar of Cain is really good, you probably don't need him. I think all of the stuff that he does, if you are picking units from among the most powerful units in the index, I think if you just make a list and then you look at the points that you have left over, I think you're already going to have things that do the jobs that he does well a little bit more efficiently, but he's not bad. And if you're an Eandon player who really wants to have like a Wraith Knight and a couple of Wraith Lords and a lot of Wraith Infantry, I don't think that you're going to be handicapping yourself by doing that. I think he's a perfectly reasonable pick. I just don't think he's quite as competitive as some of the other options. And the fact that he does have that ballistic skill and weapon skill of 4 is balanced a little bit by the detachment rule that's going to let him re-roll one of those dice to hit and one of those dice to wound. But that's also true of everything else in the army. Okay, I guess technically I have to talk about the Hemlock Wraith Fighter because it has Wraith in its keywords, and I'm doing Wraiths. I'll start by saying don't take it. It's one of the only misses in the whole index. Well, don't take it for competitive play, by all means. Take whatever you want for fun narrative casual games. It's a really cool looking model. I love my Hemlock Wraith Fighter. It does do one thing that's pretty awesome. The Mind Shock pod, now what it does is while an enemy unit is within 9 inches, that is a big bubble for a big base model. Subtract 1 from Battle Shock and leadership tests taken for that unit. And Battle Shock is big in this edition. Not being able to use stratagems and not being able to have any objective control at all, that's really significant. So I think that if this unit were a little bit more competitively pointed, it potentially would be a good pick. But I think it's 155 points, and it doesn't hover for some reason. It's not durable. It doesn't have the -1 to hit that flyers have traditionally had, which is sad. It's got its Mind Shock pod, and it has 2 heavy D-scythes, and what they do is D6 attacks each, hitting on 4s. They are strength 12, -4 AP, flat 2 damage. So they're good Marine killers. Pick up some Marines. It has the Psychic keyword, I think. Yeah, Psychic keyword, but it doesn't actually have any Psychic powers anymore. It's toughness 8, 12 wounds, 3-up save, no invuln. So it's pretty fragile. The Mind Shock pod power is good, but it's really easy for an opponent to get rid of, and kind of expensive. Like, it's more expensive significantly than a Fire Prism with significantly less survivability and worse damage output. Just don't do it for your competitive lists. Do it for the lulz. Okay, vehicles. Aeldari vehicles are extremely strong in 10th edition. We have a plethora of excellent choices. But because it is first in the index, we will start with the least excellent of these choices. It is not even a little bit excellent. It is not good. And that is the Crimson Hunter, which makes me sad. I have several of these. The Crimson Hunter is overcosted at 160 points and under durable at toughness 8 with a 5-up invuln and 12 wounds, and just not very scary with a couple of Bright Lances and a Pulse Laser and no abilities to offset this. It has +1 to hit and wound against stuff that can fly, but it's not like you were struggling to kill stuff that could fly. It doesn't hover. It doesn't have the -1 to hit. And the 160 point value on it compared to any of the other vehicles, which for the most part hit harder, are more durable, and are cheaper. Theoretically, what aircraft have going for them is that they can get around and target anything on the table, but we already have a lot of ways of doing that. So it's not efficiently pointed. Those are both aircraft are picks for casual games. All right, the Falcon. The Falcon is good. It's a transport still. It can hold up to 6 models at, I think, 140 points. Is that right? Yeah, 140 points. So a little bit more expensive than the Fire Prism, which is an elimination tank. And so in order to get the value out of the Falcon, you really have to be using it as a transport, but then also be using it as a combat vehicle. And theoretically, that's what it is. The first thing you need to do is uncouple your expectations from last edition. It is no longer some sort of deep striking drop pod first turn alpha strike tank. That's not what it does. It's a low occupancy transport with pretty good fire that moves units around, insulates them, and then gives them a crazy bonus the turn that they come out of the transport. So it has the standard stat line for Aeldari tanks. It's a 14-inch move, T9, 3 up save, 12 wounds, objective control 3. That's kind of cool. And then it has a pulse laser. The pulse laser got a big come down in this edition. It's a 48-inch range, which is nice, but 3 attacks, hitting on 3, strength 9. Actually, maybe it didn't. -2 AP, D6 damage. Huh. I was confusing it with something else. Yeah, it's not bad. It's not bad. You can stick a Bright Lance on there, and you should, probably for the points. It's the most competitive pick. 36-inch range. We know what Bright Lances do. D6 plus 2 damage. You can get to 8 with Fate dice. So it has some good shooting on top of those Shuriken, underslung Shuriken catapults. It has some good shooting. But its ability... It can deep strike. It can still deep strike, but it's no longer a turn 1 like alpha strike, deep strike that breaks all of those rules. But it can still deep strike, and then it has fire support. In your shooting phase, after this model is shot, select one enemy unit hit by one or more of those attacks, and until the end of the turn, each time a friendly unit that disembarked from this transport makes an attack against the target enemy unit, you can reroll the wound roll. So if you had some, say, fire, like you're not going to put fire dragons in here. They're good already. Some Dire Avengers in here with their 3 attacks and their strength 4. Potentially your Dire Avengers, if they're all rerolling those 4s, anything that's under like T8 will really take some damage from the Dire Avengers. That's good. So you could like bring in the Falcon, dump the Dire Avengers, shoot whatever the Dire Avengers are going to shoot with the underslung Shuriken catapults, because if it's a big infantry unit or something, use the heavy weapons on a hard target, and then the Dire Avengers would have a big bonus to damage the thing. Maybe you have Asserman on the squad or something. It's good. I think the other advantage to the Falcon is, I think that potentially in the beginning of this edition we're going to see a lot of indirect fire, and Eldar infantry are all pretty fragile. So if you have some infantry squads that you need to keep alive, this is a way to do it, and it's also a combat vehicle. It's a way to get Eldred into position for Doom. It's a way to move around a Phoenix Lord that wants to be a bit closer to the enemy, like Fugan. There's stuff you can do with this. And potentially something like a combat character coming out of the transport suddenly being able to reroll all of its wound rolls if it has a high volume of attacks could theoretically be really good. And don't forget, because it's likely that this tank will be playing the midfield, you can always use the vehicle shock stratagem for 1 CP to just fly it into something and dump an average of 3 mortal wounds on it. And again, don't forget that with Fate Dice, you can use your... you could Bright Lance something at the end of your opponent's movement phase and just auto hit with it, even though it only hits on 6s. So again, it gives you some mid-table control. It's a solid pick, and I bet we'll come up with some tricky ways to use it with combat characters. Okay, moving on. The Fire Prism. The Fire Prism is fabulous. It's so good. I think, for one thing, it is good. The Wraith Knight is amazing. We talked about that. But for the cost of 1 Wraith Knight, you can get 3 Fire Prisms, which is one of the reasons that I'm skeptical about a second Wraith Knight. I don't think their second Wraith Knight is bad, by the way. No hate comments, please. I was beaten up enough in the first video, and rightly so, for my comments about Wraith Knights. But I do think the fact that you can get 3 Fire Prisms for the cost of a Wraith Knight is worth mentioning. And they're so freaking good. So it's the standard stat line for the tank itself. Then the Prism Cannon has 2 different profiles, of which one is obviously better. It's a 60-inch range. It can reach out and touch anything on the table. The Focused Lance, this is the one that I'm excited about, is 2 attacks, linked fire, so it rerolls wounds automatically. Strength 18, woo, with the wound rerolls, and you're rerolling one of those hits simply by virtue of being in an Aeldari detachment. -4 AP, flat 6 damage, and what I like about flat 6 damage is you don't need to use a Fate dice. We have a ton of Fate dice. You're going to start the game with 12, 15 if you run Eldred. Your Farseer will be manipulating a couple per turn. Maybe your Guardians are getting you more. There are other ways to get more, but you're still not going to have, on any given turn, you're not going to just have all 6s. That's not, sometimes the way we talk about this stuff, it makes it sound like that's the case. You will have a ton of 6s over the course of the game, because your Farseer can keep manipulating those dice, But on turn 1 or 2, you do not have infinite 6s. So having weapons that do just do flat 6 damage is pretty great. And it's got the crystal targeting matrix, so you can reroll one hit roll and you can reroll the wound roll when resolving those attacks. So even if you didn't, so even when you're not firing the focused lance profile, you'll be able to reroll wound rolls. And the crystal targeting matrix means, you've probably already done the math, that if you're getting one reroll for your attachment ability and one reroll for that, it's rerolling everything. It rerolls every hit and every wound. But that's not all. The linked fire ability gives fire prisms the ability to shoot as though they had the line of sight of any other fire prism on the field. So you can pick a fire prism. If you have 2 of these in your list, either one of them can trigger its shooting attacks as though it were the other. And this is important for a variety of reasons. One is that because you could have, okay, so let's say you have 3 fire prisms in your list. We're getting crazy here, but imagine this. And only one of those fire prisms, it has line of sight on the enemy. You tuck its fin out or whatever. All of the fire prisms can shoot the target that only that one fire prism can see, or targets. And then you could use Phantasm or Fire and Fade to tuck that one fire prism out of line of sight and have them all totally safe. And this is one of the reasons that I was initially, before I really thought about it and looked at the data sheet and remembered that it's 10th edition, not 9th edition, skeptical about the Wraith Knight, is that your fire prisms have crazy damage output with full rerolls, and you can keep them pretty much totally safe. The Wraith Knight towers, so the Wraith Knight can see stuff that's behind obscuring terrain as long as it has true line of sight. Fire prisms can't do that, but anything that your opponent moves into view of any part of your army, if you have a couple of fire prisms on your flanks or something, is in real trouble. And again, if you move one of your fire prisms a little bit further towards the middle of the table, you have that 24-inch Overwatch bubble where at the end of your opponent's movement phase, you can use a fate die to just automatically hit something with the lance, which is just crazy. These are very aggressively pointed at 125 points. That's really good. If you are going to take 3, I think it probably makes sense to consider at least starting one in strategic reserve, for the simple reason that it's pretty hard to hide 3 full footprint tanks in your backfield on top of the other stuff that you're going to have on turn 1. And doing it that way would make it possible too for you to sort of play aggressively with one of them, use the Overwatch bubble. You don't have to worry terribly if it gets destroyed. You've got another one coming in, and at 125 points, they're not disposable, but they're pretty cheap. If you lose one, it isn't that big a deal. They are a little bit fragile, right? Because anything hitting it with -4 AP, you won't have the option to just auto succeed. Those of you who are not Craft Worlds players who are listening to this to figure out how to beat Craft Worlds are like, you're not allowed to be mad about that, and you're right. But unlike a lot of our other durable stuff, our tanks, unless they have access to an invuln, cannot auto succeed against high AP weapons. So it is fragile, but wow, the damage output is excellent. It's very competitively priced, and it makes a lot of room for shenanigans. The other profile, the Dispersed Pulse, is also good. It's also 60 inches, 2d6 attacks, ballistic skill 3, strength 6, -1, flat 2. Really good marine killer. It's blast, really good against just regular infantry too. It does not thrill me the way the focused lance does, especially with the -1 AP. But it does mean that at any stage of the game into any list, your fire prism will have good aggressive play. Okay, the Night Spinner. The Night Spinner is also good. It's both pretty good indirect fire, and it has a cool utility power that gives you control. I always like when Craft Worlds is kind of a control army. Like it messes with what your opponent can do, and I think this unit has a good vibe with reference to that sort of lore narrative element of play. It's 140 points. It's a bit more than the Fire Prism, and it's not as hard hitting. But the Doomweaver is D6 plus 3 attacks, which I like way better than the 2d6 that it was before, because you're a little bit less likely to just whiff on it. It is blast, and the way blast works now is a little bit more generous. So if you're targeting the kind of unit that this can actually damage, you're likely to get a couple of additional attacks on top. Devastating wounds, that's cool. Now, because it's low damage output, you're not going to be like using a roll of a 6 to do crazy damage. Indirect fire, we know that. Twin linked, you're rerolling all of the wound rolls, so that will probably get you a couple of extra 6s. You're likely to do 2 to 4 mortal wounds when you shoot with this thing. 48-inch range is good. The Night Spinner, it hits on 3s, but you're at -1 because it's indirect fire. You get to reroll 1 of those. And then the issue is no AP, and because of the rules for indirect fire, whatever you're targeting will always automatically get cover, because that's how it works. So a lot of units will be saving on 3s. Light infantry, maybe not. Flat 2 damage, though, does mean that it's a Space Marine killer. But what makes this really interesting is the monofilament web ability. In your shooting phase, after this model is shot, you can choose an enemy that was hit by one of or more of those attacks, and it's pinned. You subtract 2 from its movement characteristic, and it cannot advance. There are all sorts of enemy units that will be part of a battle plan that will depend on them advancing. And you newer, less experienced players might be thinking, well, this is a way to slow down my enemy's powerful melee units. Yes, but that is not the most important part of this. Your opponent might have a battle plan that involves particular units being able to get particular places on the table on turn 1 or turn 2 in order to score a primary objective, or in order to do some sort of secondary tactic. And if you can just stop that unit from being able to make an advanced move and inflict -2 to its move characteristic, significantly removing its movement, you might really mess up your opponent's battle plan. I think that the Night Spinner is going to... I think if all you want to do is kill stuff, we have better indirect fire that's more efficiently priced. But I think that a single Night Spinner is going to be a really interesting tactical tool for very advanced players who really know how to predict what an opponent's battle plan is and mess with their ability to score. I'm not convinced you're ever going to want more than one of these in a list. Maybe you would. I think we have a lot of good indirect fire options, though. So at 140 points, I'm not sure that this necessarily makes the grade for massed indirect fire. Okay, I'm breezing past some Harlequin vehicles because I'm going to talk about all the Harlequin stuff in my next video when I also talk about Ynnari and Corsairs. So support weapons. Support weapons were when we saw the reveal at the Kansas City Open. I talked about these a great deal in that Kansas City Open reveal video. These were the first darling of 10th edition for Aeldari. They're 85 points, and wow, the D cannon is good. Again, it was good in the last edition. It's good again. Support weapons can now only be taken in units of 1. So those of you who have 9, sorry, I have a lot of them too. But I think this is better. I would rather be able to have 3 of these things at 85 points each than have to buy big units of them for more points and have them not be as efficient or something. So the D cannon is 24 inches, D3 attacks, hits on 3s, strength 16, -4 AP, D6 plus 2 damage, indirect fire, but also devastating wounds. So, and heavy, meaning that if you don't do this, if you don't move the platform, it actually hits on 2s. It's blast, so you can also target regular infantry with it, and if you and get additional hits. And if you, we've already said this, but if you use a 6 on your fate dice for the wound roll, not only does it automatically push the mortal wounds through, but if you're targeting infantry because it's mortal wounds, you're also, this is like with the Wraith Cannon I was talking about with pushing through the devastating wounds. This threatens any kind of unit in the game, right? This can wipe out a unit of guardsmen. It can blow up a tank. It can kill heavy infantry. It can kill light infantry. It can kill anything. You can spend a fate die to get the mortal wounds, and then spend another fate die to guarantee that you do 8 mortals, and that's terrifying. So good. Also, It has the artillery barrage ability. In your shooting phase, after this unit has shot, select one or more enemy units, excluding monster and vehicle units that was hit by one or more of those attacks, until the start of the next turn. When this unit is on the battlefield, that enemy unit is suppressed. While the unit is suppressed, each time a model in that unit makes an attack, subtract 1 from the hit roll. So you also give it -1 to hit. That ability is clearly not intended for the D cannon. It's intended for the Shadow Weaver, which is D6 plus 2 attacks with blast, devastating wounds, also heavy, also indirect, strength 6, no AP, 1 damage, but the 48-inch range instead of the 24-inch range is important. The Shadow Weaver is for picking up units in your opponent's deployment zone that are holding objectives. And if there's nothing like that to kill, then you can use it to maybe do a little bit of damage and throw -1 to hit on something. I think a single Shadow Weaver, if you want to have some indirect fire play, if you have a single Shadow Weaver and alongside either the Reaper Exarch with the Tempest Launcher, because I think Reapers are only 75 points, suddenly it's potentially doable. Those two things in combination with one another absolutely can every turn probably delete like a backfield enemy utility unit that's scoring points on an objective or whatever else. Could be a problem for an opponent. And having the ability to pivot into throwing a -1 to hit on something is pretty good, but it doesn't apply to monsters and vehicles. At 85 points, I think there is an argument for not doing it. The D cannon is definitely worth it for 85 points. The Shadow Weaver would be hardcore worth it at 65. It's a good tool, and it's worth thinking about ways to play around with. But the D cannon is the obvious pick here. And if you can use units like the Avatar of Cain, like the Wraiths with the cannons, and that Overwatch tactic where you create this 24-inch bubble to create safety in the midfield, like bubbles your opponent doesn't want to move into, that gives you an opportunity to scoot your D cannons up out of your deployment zone into the midfield so that they can reach out and touch the enemy's deployment zone. One advantage that the Shadow Weaver and the D cannons have over the Tempest Launcher and the Dark Reaper unit is that they themselves are not quite as vulnerable to indirect fire. Most indirect fire in the game is anti-infantry. The D cannon, not all of it. The D cannon is also kind of a standout for that reason. So whereas your Dark Reapers might die to indirect fire, the Shadow Weaver is less likely to do so. The Vibro Cannon is not worth taking. Don't even think about taking the Vibro Cannon. But I think most Craft Worlds lists are going to look at having a couple of D cannons in there. They're just so efficiently pointed and so dangerous, and again, they can kill anything that they can reach. Vipers, Vipers are good. Vipers have a really cool utility power. They are efficiently pointed, and because all weapons loadouts cost the same now, you can stick a Bright Lance on them and call it a win. It's 75 points for a move 14 T6, 3-up save, 6 wound, 2 objective control, like mini vehicle that has harassment fire. In your shooting phase, after it's shot an enemy unit, the enemy unit loses the benefit of cover. And keep in mind, too, that because it's also got the shuriken catapults on there, you can always shoot something with the shuriken catapults, just strip cover, and then shoot what you really want to shoot with the Bright Lance. And because of the Eldar detachment ability, the Bright Lance is firing 1 shot, but that means that it has full rerolls to hit and full rerolls to wound, significantly increasing its efficiency for 75 points. I like that Vipers are fast enough to move out, get a bead on an enemy that really has to get hit. You blast the enemy unit with the Bright Lance, you use your Fate dice to guarantee that you do 8 damage to it, and then you don't really worry if they kill your 75-point Viper. The Viper is a trading unit, and it is efficiently pointed for that. And if you are trading your Viper to do 8 damage to something that needs to take 8 damage and also strip something else of cover and absorb some of your opponent's attention for a turn, that's totally worth it. Also, I do think, like, this is kind of weird for Eldar players because we're so accustomed to being fragile, but I do think that if you've got stuff in your list, like the Wraith Knight, like the Avatar of Cain, like some Wraith Infantry, your opponent might just struggle to allocate resources to stuff like destroying Vipers. It might weirdly be a little bit more survivable than it would have been in the last edition. But if you can fit these things into your list, they're a useful tool. Also, I think this is a great trick. I mentioned this in a previous video. They have the same Wraithbone hull as tanks, so it's a 75-point unit that you can fly into anything, spend 1 CP on the tank shock stratagem, and probably do 3 mortal wounds. Roll 6 dice, and on 4-ups, you do mortal wounds. And that is a great thing to be able to pivot into for 1 CP with a disposable, fast, light tank. Warwalkers. I saw some memes on Facebook that people were like upset about what had happened to Warwalkers, which I am confused by because I think they look great. They've just gotten better. They were pretty good in the last edition, and they've just gotten better. Their movement 10, T7, 6 wounds, 3-up save, 2 objective control. That's cool. They've got that scout move, 9 inches. They have a power field, so they all automatically have fortune. They're -1 to wound, and now they have a 4-up invuln instead of a 5-up invuln. They're 95 points, and they're genuinely durable. These are a pain in the ass to eliminate. Anything that's less than strength 7 is only going to wound them on a 6, so they're super efficient against light arms. And then even stuff like las cannons are only going to wound them on a 4, and then they have a 4-up invuln. They're genuinely durable. And for 95 points, you can stick 2 Bright Lances on them and have 2 attacks that hit on 3s. It's strength 12, -3 AP, D6 + 2 damage. It's so good. And because it scouts too. The other thing I like about these things is it's going to be hard to fit everything in your deployment zone out of line of sight that you want. So there's nothing to stop you from setting up your Warwalkers in a position at the front of your deployment zone, totally in the open, where they can run behind obscuring ruins in the midfield, give you initial control in the midfield. So when the game starts, you'll already have 1 unit or 2 units with Bright Lances sitting out of line of sight, out of your deployment zone, in the mid, so not taking up space in your precious you can't shoot me portion of your deployment zone, in the midfield with that 24-inch Overwatch bubble. So on turn 1, if your opponent tries to move into the midfield with something really scary, you can spend a fate die and just auto shoot it with a Bright Lance, and your other Bright Lance will have a 1 in 3 chance of hitting because you get a free reroll because it's Eldar. So maybe you'll even hit it twice. Warwalkers are great. So good. At 95 points, you probably aren't putting anything on them other than Bright Lances, though. Unless your meta calls for it. Maybe you're a meta where it's all hordes and you want some scatter lasers or something, but I think generally the Bright Lance is the obvious pick. Okay, the Wave Serpent. The Wave Serpent is it's the transport we know and love. The meta has changed. The edition has changed. The Wave Serpent has not changed a great deal, but we'll go through it. It's the standard. It has the standard tank profile. It has a Serpent shield. It still holds 12 infantry or 6 Wraiths. Once per battle, you can select 1 enemy unit that is within 12 inches and visible to this model and roll 1d6, and on a 2-up, that enemy suffers d3 mortal wounds and has to take a battle shock test. Battle shock tests are really good. The ability to discharge the Wave Serpent shield and potentially cause an opponent to just lose all of their objective control or not be able to use a stratagem could be fabulous. I think that the Wave Serpent shield might be the sleeper component of the Wave Serpent, that it is not obvious to us now, makes it a really solid include in a list. I also think this about the Death Jester. I'll talk about that when we get to Harlequins in a later video. But the ability to force a battle shock test is good. And some armies are really good at it, like Tyranids. Eldar don't do it a lot. I'll also point out that the Wave Serpent shield discharge, if you were also ramming something with tank shock, you could potentially be doing D3 mortal wounds plus another average of 3 mortal wounds. You could do 5 mortal wounds to something, and that's pretty cool. The weapons on the Wave Serpent are okay. I'm not crazy about twin-linked Bright Lances. I already said this because they have literally no added utility over a single Bright Lance, because what twin-linked does is it lets you reroll the wound roll, but you already get a reroll to hit and a reroll to wound, and it only fires 1 shot, so they do literally nothing. In the current detachment that we have, a Bright Lance and a twin Bright Lance are the same weapon. There is a curious some people have pointed out that for some reason, the twin star cannons have 4 attacks instead of 2 attacks. All of the other twin-linked heavy weapons have the same number of attacks as a single version of the heavy weapon, but they reroll the wound roll. And we have all speculated that this is probably a typo or a mistake. Probably it is. It will probably be corrected at some point, but maybe it's not. I can't imagine that that's true because it's just objectively better than the twin-linked shuriken cannon, but I assume that that'll get corrected at some point. I think you're either going to, if you are going to take this thing, though, you're either going to want the singleton weird bright lance or maybe the twin star cannons. There's an argument for that for sure. It's going to do 2 things, aside from the trick we just talked about with the Wave Serpent shield and the running into things, which I think is good. The Wave Serpent's going to do 2 things for you. One, it's going to keep infantry units alive on turn 1 against enemies with really good indirect fire. So I'll admit, I'm a little bit worried about what happens to my Farseer running with 10 Guardian Defenders in my backfield if I come up against a bunch of Desolators, like a Space Marine list with 30 Desolators. The Wave Serpent solves that. They start in the Wave Serpent, right? I think it may feel a little bit bad to pay 120 points if we're not also doing other stuff with it, but 120 points is good. I mean, that's good competitive pricing. It's just, I think a lot of the infantry in our list is there's not as much infantry this edition. Tanks are really good, right? And a lot of our infantry, our utility infantry, it just seems like a lot to pay the cost of the squad again to put it into a transport. It could totally be worth doing. I can certainly imagine a situation, for example, where I start that Farseer in the Wave Serpent with the bodyguard to protect it from indirect fire on turn 1. On my turn 1, I try to pick up their indirect fire with my indirect fire. I get them out of the transport. My Wraiths with cannons get into the transport. It moves to the midfield, right? Like, I can imagine a lot of ways to play with this, and I think most of those ways probably do involve something getting out, something getting in, and then you can do all the old shenanigans you used to do with the Wave Serpent, like move block. It's good for that, especially at 120 points. There's so much good stuff in the Codex that I might have trouble fitting it in my lists. I shouldn't say Codex, excuse me, Index. But there are some tricks there. It's not bad, and I do think the discharge on the shield really counts for something. I think it's really good. Okay, that's vehicles. Actually, no, one last note about vehicles before we move on. When I was talking about the Falcon, I mentioned splitting your fire in order to trigger fire support by targeting the thing that you want rerolls against with the underselling shuriken catapults and the thing that you want to destroy with your heavy weapons I should have mentioned the underslung shuriken catapults, that's what's on my Falcon models because that's how they're modeled, but there's no reason now not to replace them with the shuriken cannon. Yes, catapults can still shoot after you advance, but that isn't it's just not coming up that much with these tanks. You really are better off just having the shuriken cannon. If you don't have one, you can buy one on eBay for a couple of bucks or a couple of quid, as you say in the UK. And if it really comes to it, I don't run any 3D printed models. But I've never done this. I wouldn't feel guilty if it was the only way to get a shuriken cannon. And I'm not even sure that some of the older kits came with the shuriken cannon as an option. I don't really remember, but I feel like maybe they didn't. So on your Wave Serpent, your Falcon, anything that has that basic tank chassis, there's no reason for free not just to upgrade to the shuriken cannon. Okay, Outcasts. Outcasts refers to those Eldar who have decided to abandon the craft world, usually temporarily, to embrace a pathless life of adventure. Outcasts are not to be trusted. Without the path, what are we? That's how you end up getting eaten by Slaanesh. But it's narratively interesting, and they sure are good on the table. I'm talking, of course, about Rangers and Shroud Runners, so let's talk about them. Although I really did already talk about Rangers quite a bit in the previous video when I was talking about the incredible combination with Aeldari Knight Spear. If you haven't already listened to that, I strongly recommend checking that out. So Rangers have the elf stat line. The Ranger, here's what's new. They have a 5-up invulnerable save now instead of the shenanigans with their bonuses when they were in cover with their cloaks. The 5-up invuln save, that's great. They still have infiltrators, so they can set up in the midfield up to 9 inches from the opponent's deployment zone. They have stealth, so they're -1 to hit. And the Ranger long rifle, in addition to being able to target characters, now does 2 damage instead of its mortal wound trickery. That's really good. If they're running in a big unit with Illic, they're like basically auto character killers because they get rerolls to wound and they do all the Illic tricks that I talked about in that other video. They're untargetable outside of 12 inches. At 55 points, though, a basic unit of Rangers, if you're not running them with Illic, is a really good utility unit in the midfield. Being able to put them anywhere in the midfield up to 9 inches from the enemy deployment zone. It's a really cheap unit for screening out your opponent's deep strikers. I think I talked about this in the other video. You want infiltrators out in front of your army just in case your opponent has infiltrators, so that your opponent can't set up their powerful melee infiltrators 9 inches from your deployment zone, because when you put one of these units down, it creates that 9-inch bubble. You can, if you have a few of these things and you deploy them before your opponent, potentially you can keep your opponent from being clever. Also, scout moves that can't finish too close to an enemy unit. This is a way to prevent those. It's just a really useful utility in your army to have infiltrators that can do this. And then Rangers have this other pretty powerful ability called Path of the Outcast. Once per turn, when an enemy unit ends a normal move, advance, or fallback move within 9 inches of this unit, if it's not within engagement range of one or more enemy units, you can make a normal move of up to D6 as if it were your movement phase. Now, the most obvious thing to do with this is to force an enemy to fail a charge. So if you have Rangers out in front of your army and they're like kind of like out of sight, line of sight behind ruins, so your opponent can't see them to target them, and then tries to move some infantry unit that can run through the ruin and engage them in melee, well, if you just fall back D6 inches, you can probably make that charge completely impossible. And then their melee unit is just kind of stuck out in the open. There's nothing for it to charge. So they're a really efficient screening unit, both to keep enemy infiltrators at bay, but also to prevent charges. They're really cheap at 55 points, so they're totally fine to just do actions with. The precision ability on the long rifle with the flat 2 damage in a bigger unit, or with Illic, or with some kind of buff, that really can pop characters. But here's the other fun trick with Path of the Outcasts. If they are running with Illic, I should have mentioned this when I was talking about Illic. I really like the idea of just having them in your backfield, 10 of these guys with Illic up on some elevated position, so they're getting plunging fire, and they're completely untargetable outside of 12 inches. But if you do want to play Illic in the midfield with these guys, because of Path of the Outcast, if your opponent tries to shut down the 12-inch bubble by getting close enough to them to target them, they can just pass at the Path of the Outcast and scuttle away, and potentially just be untargetable again outside of 12 inches because of that lone operative thing, which is very Eldari and it's very Outcasty. It's not quite as powerful as it sounds, because if they can get really deep inside that 9 inches with a move, you're not going to be able to run far enough. If there are multiple opponents' units in the midfield, you might just not be able to get away from them. But I think it's very funny, and I think it is kind of a cool trick and something to think about. So Rangers are they're aggressively pointed. If you want to hear about using them as killers, listen to that segment about Illic. But I do just think as like a screening and utility unit out in front of the army, they're really good. And a lot of us are we're looking at all the cool stuff in the Codex, and we're loading up our initial lists with tanks and Wraith Knights and monsters. You need infantry, people, because you've got to be able to do actions and score. So there do have to be some infantry in there just for scoring purposes, and I think Rangers are a great pick for that. I do think in the early part of the edition there are going to be people losing games simply because the opponent just like kills all of their infantry with indirect fire or whatever in the first couple turns, and they just can't. They don't have the necessarily the secondary scoring potential that they need in certain kinds of matchups and certain kinds of missions. We'll see how it goes. Obviously, that's not Knights have ways around this, but I do think that for some of these initial lists, it's going to be a problem. Okay, Shroud Runners, the delightful new model from last edition. What could be better than a Ranger on a bike? Well, 2 Rangers on a bike. Shroud Runners are still good, in part because they're competitively pointed at 80. That's for 3 of them, or 160 for 6. You do not need 6. But the 80's great because they scout 9 inches. They've got that scout move, so they're not infiltrators, but they've got the scout move. They have stealth, so they have a native -1 to hit, and they still have 3 wounds. They're toughness 4. The 4-up save is not amazing, but they have a 5-up invulnerable save now. And I admit, I'm going to miss being able to give Shroud Runners like a 2-up save and cover. That was pretty cool, but they can have a 3-up save and cover. That's pretty good. For their points, I think that they're a little bit durable. They're certainly reasonably durable against small arms, not against anything even like medium weight. But what they do that is interesting is their target acquisition ability. You pick an enemy unit within 12 inches invisible to this unit, and until the end of phase, ranged weapons equipped by friendly Aeldari models have the lethal hits ability when targeting that unit. Now, including, they give this to themselves. So if they're targeting something within 12 inches, they have lethal hits against it, both with the scatter laser and with the Ranger long rifle. So this is, I think that this is, I think people are not necessarily realizing what a good tool lethal hits can be. Because there are all of these models in the game which now are much higher toughness. It's much harder for small arms to necessarily deal with big, tough stuff. So if you have even like -1 AP on something and lethal hits with high volume of fire, and you open up on a thing, you can really mess it up. Dire Avengers would normally be like the obvious unit that you would want to pair with this, but Dire Avengers have lethal hits naturally. If you were running something like a big scatterbike squad or anything that's going to have volume of fire for small arms that doesn't normally have lethal hits, the ability to just hose something, especially if you throw guide on a big unit like the scatterbikes and then reroll all of your non-6s. Those of you who were running the Shuriken blowout combo in the last edition know how powerful this can be. If you can push through a whole bunch of auto wounds with even -1 AP, right, you can put some real damage on something like a hard target. So in a mirror match, for example, if you were targeting somebody's Wraith Knight and just hosing it with like 100 shots of -1 AP small arms, and you had lethal hits on there, and you threw guide on one of your larger units, you could do some real damage. Damage reduction doesn't matter on -1, and you can't use fate dice to beat weight of dice, and so on. So lethal hits is powerful, and the ability to just give everything lethal hits against this, the target is pretty good. I think the issue we're going to run into with this at the moment is currently we don't have, other than a big unit of Dire Avengers which have this anyway, there aren't a whole lot of really tempting high volume fire units. But I suspect that there's a combo or a couple of combos. I think there's probably ways to capitalize on this in a list, and I don't think we're going to see people doing it early in the edition. But I could totally see in a few months, or 8 or 9 months, especially after maybe there's some changes and some FAQs, I could see this being a tool that people are leaning into in some interesting ways. I think it's more powerful than it initially appears. Shroud Runners also have underslung scatter lasers, and they have the long rifle, and the long rifle has precision and whatever. You know, they're a perfectly good unit in their own right, just as a nippy, scouty, grab objective, screening, tradey unit. But like that target acquisition thing is really good. Okay, let's talk Guardians and then call it done. Two Guardian units. They're not Outcasts. They just don't fit anywhere else. They're, amateur citizenry. They're auxilia of some kind. Well, I guess auxilia have to come from somewhere else, right? I don't know what they are. They're irregulars or something. So Guardians are good. Both Guardian Defenders and Storm Guardians are good because they have this interesting utility power. I mentioned in my intro video, part 1 of this, that I think broadly speaking in the game there are 3 kinds of infantry now, and like all made-up categories, that's not precisely accurate. But broadly speaking, there are these units that would have previously been troops back when that was a thing that they're not really killers. They hold objectives in your backfield. They have some utility power. They contribute in some other way. They're like your more amateurish soldiers. And then you have elites, which generally are good at killing other infantry, or in some cases tanks and monsters, like with fire dragons. And then you have heavy infantry, which are for holding positions and being immovable. Now, Guardians are the first type. They're not killers, but they do something really interesting for you. Defenders of Fate. At the end of your command phase, for each objective marker you control that has one or more units from your army with this ability within range, which is weird because I don't think anyone else has Defenders of Fate, roll 1d6 and add it to your Fate dice pool. So every turn that your Guardians are standing on an objective in your command phase, they are going to get you another Fate die. And that's great. They're a little, you can no longer take Guardian Defenders as squads of 20. You can only take them in 10, and you automatically get the platform, but it also means you automatically pay for the platform, kinda. It's 110 points. There are only two, you can put anything on there. There are only two things you want to put on there. You either want the Bright Lance, you probably want the Bright Lance, or maybe just for the 48-inch range, the missile launcher. I mentioned in the first video that if you had like a foot autarch with a launcher leading a unit of Guardians, you could be phantasming or fire and fading just the platform and the autarch in and out and shooting, and the autarch would be giving you command bonuses, and it's a thing you could do. I think here's what you're not going to do with Guardians. You're not going to like put them into reserve the way you used to and like bring them out on a board edge and hose something with shuriken fire. Their shuriken fire is not that impressive. You want Dire Avengers if you want mass shuriken fire. They've got their standard shuriken catapult with an 18-inch range and 2 shots, and they hit on 3s and strength 4 -1. It's what it's always been. So 10 of these are going to put out 20 shuriken shots. It's not bad. It's like if it gets to the late game and things are getting scrappy and your opponent is with what she has left pushing into your backfield and your Guardians are still alive on that objective, they're a threat. Or if something deep strikes into your backfield and is doing some damage, your Guardians can mess it up. But they are not at 110 points for what they do, a combat unit. They're not a combat unit. They're fragile with their 4-up save, but it's totally worth having potentially a unit of these things in your list just to control an objective in your backfield and pick up some additional Fate dice. That said, I talked about Guardians once before when GW did the initial reveal for each faction, but we didn't have point values or anything, and we didn't know the platform would be free. I do have a new hesitation about Guardian Defenders, and it's not that they're not good. It's that there's so much powerful indirect fire in the beginning of this edition. Like Imperial Guard has really good. I thought like Eldar have fabulous indirect fire. Imperial Guard has really good indirect fire, and we are not the only factions. There's a fair amount of it. So if you come up against an opponent who knows what Eldar do and knows how good Fate dice are and sees a unit of Guardian Defenders in your backfield, I'm pretty sure on turn 1 those Guardian Defenders disappear, especially if you don't have a lot of the units that we're going to be taking to kill stuff are not going to be the kinds of units that are vulnerable to anti-infantry indirect fire anyway. So we might find our Guardian Defenders just getting deleted on turn 1 pretty often anyway, in which case, if that's the meta, they're not going to be worth it for 110 points. It also is potentially going to create problems for the Foot Farseer that's running with them, who's going to want to convert Fate dice. The indirect fire is just going to be a problem for those Foot Seers in general. There's a lot of talk about like, how do you play into Eldar right now? And I get it. Like, I'm not, the faction is arguably, I don't know if it's the strongest in the game right now, but it is way up there. But I think the way you play into Eldar right now is you strangle their Fate dice. I think you kill the Farseers, and without Lookout Sir as a thing, and without any truly tough bodyguard units, and with a lot of precision in the game and lots of fast melee, I don't think that that's necessarily a tall order. And you strangle the Fate dice generation. So if you can kill the Guardians and the Foot Farseer, that's a thing. And I don't know that it's necessarily going to be that tough. So Guardian Defenders, they've got a great ability, totally worth it for the points. I am going to start off probably with a unit of these things in most of my lists, but I do think that it's possible that the volume of good anti-infantry indirect fire in the game might mean that we have to revisit them a little bit. It's a damn shame that the warlocks, I was really hoping that the individual warlocks would have Protect Jinx, because if you could put a warlock and a guardian squad and a Farseer and have the warlock throw Protect on the squad that he's in and then have them in cover, like, then we'd be okay. But that's not where we are. Maybe when we get the Codex. But also Eldar players, I think, are currently not really allowed to complain about anything like that for reasons. Okay, Storm Guardians. So Storm Guardians have a different utility power, like Guardian Defenders. They're not killers. They're slightly more expensive at 115 points. Their utility power is to make objectives sticky. And for you new players, what a sticky objective is an objective that you continue to control if you have no models within range of it, as long as your opponent has not assumed control of it. Now, this, in the case of Storm Guardians, in order to trigger the sticky objective, they have to be there in your command phase. So you can't just like run them onto something in the midfield unless you can then survive to the start of your next turn. I do think that there are going to be games, right, where there is an objective in the midfield that at least on turn one you'll be safe standing on. If it's like out of line of sight of the opponent's army and they can't on the first turn get a beat on it by moving something, and if you can run your Storm Guardians out with like you could put a warlock in the squad to auto 6 advance them. I think you would only do that once. I'm not persuaded that that is worth the points. I think you use a fate die for that, but potentially you run them out, you get them onto an objective in the midfield, and then even if they do die down the line, as long as they survive for one turn, having a sticky objective, that really creates problems for your opponent, because they can't take it away from you just by shooting off what's on it. They have to put something on it, which you then get to kill if it's near your deployment zone. The other thing they do for you is if you start them on the objective in your own deployment zone, they make that objective sticky. And again, that thing that I said about Guardian Defenders before, because I think there's going to be a lot of powerful indirect fire in the game, the ability to make a home objective sticky, I think is actually really good and potentially a reason to think about Guardian Defenders or Storm Guardians. If you're only taking one unit over Guardian Defenders, they can still be the bodyguard for your Farseer if you're not using Warlocks or whatever. And they also have to their advantage that they're a bit more durable. The Serpent shield platform thing is better than it used to be. It now gives a 5-up invulnerable save, so it like actually does something. So they have a 4-up save that's going to be a 3-up in cover. They're going to be in cover when the game starts, and they've got the 5-up invuln. That's cool. Both Guardian Defenders and Storm Guardians also have 2 objective control, obviously. But the other, I guess, good thing about them, they don't have the volume of fire. So as like a counterpuncher, if somebody comes in, if it's the late game or somebody comes into your backfield, Storm Guardians obviously don't have the volume of shuriken fire that Defenders have, and their melee profile leaves a lot to be desired. Their Guardian close combat weapon is strength 3 with no AP. They have 2 attacks. I'm a little bit annoyed by that. I feel like a sword should be better than like a gun, but 2 of them can have Aeldari power swords, which is pretty good. And weirdly, the way the rules are written now, if you give... So 2 of them can have fusion guns. Those are good. But they D6 melt to 2. That's good. But the Guardians that you give the fusion guns to, they're not supposed to have swords anymore. It doesn't really matter. I guess if you've modeled them that way, I don't think anybody's going to be like, take those off the table. It's not WYSIWYG, but like technically they have 0 attacks in melee if you read the way the data card is written. And given especially how like crappy those swords are, I don't know why they did that. I think that's a weird decision. And so you have this unit that like has a bunch of pistol shots. It has the fusion gun shots. It has the 2 Aeldari power swords in there. And collectively, with all of that stuff together, the damage output against regular infantry is going to be pretty good. And with the fusion guns, the damage output against something like a light tank or a monster that's zipped into your backfield is also going to be pretty good. And you could always fate dice one of the fusion guns. Again, they're not a combat unit, but as a end of the battle, it's down to scrappy stuff on the board in your deployment zone. They're not bad. They can do some work for you. But their real value definitely is the sticky objective. Okay, so that's what I've got. I will be back with part 3 of this index review to talk about the Harlequins, the Ynnari, the Corsairs, and anything else that's left over. If you liked this video, I hope you will click like. If you have not yet subscribed, I hope that you will subscribe. I am excited to hit 10,000 subscribers for the beginning of 10th edition. That is a milestone that I've been looking forward to for quite some time. And if you are feeling particularly supportive, you could always become a patron. And as I mentioned in a video like a year ago, what could be more Aeldari than becoming a patron of the arts? That is so Craft World Eldar. My patrons have access to an exclusive Discord where they can all talk to one another, and there are some very, very clever players on that Discord, including some top people from both the UK and the US, and also many casual players and people who enjoy narrative play. And it is a menagerie of every possible type of player, and they're super cool. So for $3 a month, you could meet those people digitally. Patrons also get early access to much of the content, and much of it is downloadable as a podcast format, essentially from Patreon itself. So there are other advantages. There are a couple of other levels too. If you want to see your images of your models in my videos, or maybe get prioritized personal correspondence. But if you have been enjoying these videos and plan to do so in the future, I definitely hugely appreciate your support. Okay, that's what I've got. Back again soon with the rest of the index review, and I hope that you are all as excited as I am to pick up the Leviathan box this weekend. Okay, take care, everyone. Back soon.